So I was in that reading group for Willard and Hildebrand. It was my first introduction to Willard's work, and it was an awesome group. And clearly taught me that I need to read more about him. And as this conference it came to be, I found myself turning to the spiritual writings, of which there are many. Hildebrand wrote Transformation in Christ, themes emerge in his work. Willard has quite a few books. And one of the first things I think I was really struck by in his work is how practical it is. He's not kind of talking in this realm of theory. He says, okay, here's the issue. This is what you do. This is how it works. And that's refreshing in a lot of spiritual reading today. So what I'm going to talk about is corporeality, the body, and moral knowledge. I'm just mentioned by kind of my background. I am a clinical neuropsychologist by training. My undergrad degree was in philosophy, and I was being fed personalism without knowing it because we read John Paul II. It was right after he became Pope, so the entire Catholic world was reading The Acting Person and trying to figure out what the hell was going on. So we did that, but I've been sort of exposed to that tradition in many ways for a long time. And my own mentor in personalist work is the Spanish philosopher Juan Manuel Burgos. I was located in Spain and connections in Central and South America, so I've learned a lot from him as well. And I'll be talking a little bit about his model of the person tonight. But I want to start with I'm going to turn to some poetry along the way. T.S. Eliot is one of my favorite poets, and I think he's relevant to Willard and Hildebrand, both in his major work, The Wasteland, which talks about the problems, and in his 4 quartets, which talk about the solution. When I started looking into Willard's work, the first comment I came across was this: spirituality, it has been said, is for the very old and for the very dead. Nobody here has attained those 2 goals yet, I think. But it was a striking comment I found. It's in the Spirit of the Disciplines. They're talking about why we don't talk about spirituality, why it's a difficult thing to talk about, and why in many ways it has disappeared. It's certainly disappeared from many of our universities. He's talked about the disappearance of moral knowledge. There's stuff that's just not there and not being handed on now, which he saw as a major, major problem. And I would agree that personalism provides some answers to that problem. So this is a conference about those 2 philosophers, Willard and Hildebrand, and it grew out of that reading group, which was just really excellent. In 2018, The Disappearance of Moral Knowledge came out, and Hildebrand also talks about moral knowledge across his books. If you read Hildebrand, you very quickly find out that there's no one place you can go to find what he says about X. You have to read all of his books and say, okay, it's here, and it's here, and it's here, and it's here, and it's here. So for Hildebrand, that includes sources like the Ethics, Morality and Situation Ethics, the Dethronement of Truth, and Graven Images. His thoughts on the spiritual life kind of course through those works. Dallas Willard is much more focused in his writing, and in many ways much more practical about it than Hildebrand is. Both philosophers lamented what they witnessed as a progressive vanishing of moral knowledge across the 20th century. But this conference also needs to be about how that essential knowledge can be reclaimed, I think. What do we do about it? We can say it's disappearing. How do we help bring it back? How do we reinsert something into the public debate, into public life that isn't really there now? In this talk, I want to focus on one particular place where moral knowledge has been lost, and that is the human body. I'm taking a course right now working on a master's in philosophy at the University of Anahuac in Mexico, and the course I'm taking is a fascinating one. It's personalism and sexual identity. And the professor has taken us kind of on a grand tour of feminist theory from about 1900, 1910 through today, and kind of illustrated the grand split that's happened in human sexuality with the advent of widespread contraception and how sexuality has been divorced from procreation. The 2 are not talked about each other as linked anymore. What are the consequences of that been? As a psychologist also, I often deal with people who are doing all sorts of nasty things to their bodies. And so I'm very concerned about the body in general. I want to consider the consequences of that loss of moral knowledge in that area with our 2 philosophers, and I'll do this in 3 stages. First, I want to consider a comprehensive vision of the human person that I've been working with for some time now, a model developed by my mentor, Juan Manuel Burgos, in his work in Integral Personalism. It's a philosophical vision grounded in the ongoing project in the 20th century, bringing together Thomism and phenomenology. So he's very much in the tradition of Wojtyła, of Edith Stein, and and other scholars who have tried to bring those traditions together. He's not sort of a separate character in this. If you look at his model of the person, which we'll look at in a moment, everything he says about affectivity is drawn straight from Hildebrand. So it's like the whole thing, it's all right there. So we know from the outset there's a common phenomenological thread between Willard, between Hildebrand and Burgos, who I'll say a little bit about along the way. And we'll look at what Willard and Hildebrand have said about our bodies, the way moral knowledge has disappeared there, and how it's affected us in that domain. So in order to speak about our two philosophers, I'm going to begin with my teacher, Juan Manuel, who has developed a model of the person that I found to be very useful across disciplines in the work that I've done. I've just published a second book in neuroethics that I call Personalist Neuroethics, in which I've argued that utilitarianism probably isn't enough to develop an ethics of neuroscience. A little something more than that. And personalism, I think, is a place where that needs to be introduced as well. I don't have a slide to put it up, but I'm going to tear this out and pass it around as soon as I'm done with the page. This is Burgos' model of the person. He talks about, and this is very consonant with Willard and with Hildebrand, he talks about the person as being composed of many different aspects of an integral unity. Body, psyche, spirit, knowledge, wisdom, affectivity, all integrated, none of those things separate, and that each of those areas interacts with, resonates with the others. So it's an attempt by him to really bring an integral vision of the human person and to talk about what that means. And moral knowledge has to be integral to that model. So I've torn out my page. John Henry, if you want to send that around. One thing I'll point out is that the internal lines of the model, the box in the middle, they're dotted. He talks about all these different aspects of the person. There's 9 of them in there, but they're not distinct. Any place where you enter the model, you're entering the person. He makes the comment very explicitly in one of his works that to touch the body is to touch the person. To touch the body is to touch the person. And so when we talk about persons, we need to include thinking about what that means. We can temporarily lift one dimension or another out, but it always gets sort of pulled back in. So let's turn briefly to Willard. Willard addresses the spiritual life of the body initially by recognizing many a misapprehension about the relation between spirituality and our physicality. A lot of the personalists I work with don't want to talk about the body, they want to talk about corporeality and the notion that it's not just the physical stuff, it's not just corpor, as Husserl was said, it's a living aspect of ourselves that resonates throughout. We never get away from our bodies, it's an integral aspect of who we are. As I said at the beginning, spirituality, it has been said, is for the very old and the very dead, Willard said. So this is where the popular idea that spiritual life frustrates or even harms the body originates, he says. This jaundiced view of the body is unfortunately well attested in Christian tradition virtually from its beginnings. We as Christians are sometimes at our best and oftentimes not at our best. The moral tradition in the first 5 centuries of the church was an integral whole. Then there was a long period of decline. Then in the Catholic tradition, that was reconstituted by Thomas Aquinas, and then there was another period of decline, reconstituted again by Alphonsus Liguori, and then another period of decline, until in one line in one document on priestly formation said, at Vatican Council, said, moral theology ought to be renewed. That's the only comment that the council made about the moral life, and people pounced on that. So good things have been happening since then. So, we know about the dualism in the Platonic tradition, drawing on Orphic tradition before that, and the view that the body is a prison, something we fall into, and that we are in some ways separate from our bodies. And what's the goal? Get out of it. Get back up into the world of the ideas. It can get worse than this in dualistic notions that see all matter as evil, but something was stuck with in this life. It can be an obstacle to reaching God in this view, something that must be then overcome. Now, Willard rightly recognizes this as a distorted notion of the body and of our corporeality, something instead that has been created by God and that therefore is good by definition. It's good by definition. That's how we need to approach it. Yes, we're fallen. We live in a post-fall state, but that state also includes redemption, a reintegration of who we are. So we're not just trapped or held prisoner by an enemy. We live with a friend. He refers to this tradition, Willard does, as repressionist, the repressionist view of the human body, and one that stands in direct opposition to the incarnation and to Christianity at its best. He takes a more balanced and fully Christian view, stating that the spiritual and the bodily are by no means opposed in human life. They're complementary. He recognizes the human person as a unity. Practically speaking, then, this means that both body and spirit, the human person, are called to sanctification. I don't hear a lot of talk about sanctification of the body when I hear about kind of moral theology and spiritual practices and things like that. It's usually something to be overcome. It gets in the way. It's a block. It's sort of, trying to make spiritual progress, and this is sort of yanking us back and making it harder. And one might ask or object, did not the early Christians, especially the Desert Fathers of the 4th century and later, view their retreat to the desert as a spiritual battle against the body? In their extremes, yes. One of the interesting things when you kind of read that tradition is that there are folks who kind of went out on a limb. There was Simon the Stylite, people who just did bizarre things. The community reeled them back in. Said, no, this is not it. Come back in and take a more balanced view of who you are, including who your body is. So the foundations of monasticism actually held the body in reverence and recognized that it was something that we needed to include in our search for salvation. It was the whole person who went to the desert. They didn't leave their body behind and then go out to the desert of Egypt. They went with them, and yes, sometimes it was a problem, but yes, also they realized they had to struggle with this to make it whole. So what are we to do with our bodies? Willard speaks of what Hildebrand names the metaphysical situation of man, a situation that cannot exclude our corporeality. The metaphysical situation of man is our post-fall condition, fallen and redeemed. As Christians, both men recognize us as fallen and redeemed, free and able to choose the path we'll follow, open to grace, and at the same time, often resistant to it. Both philosophers could immediately recognize the human condition that T.S. Eliot depicts in his 1922 work, The Wasteland. It's an extended depiction of the inward fragmentation and spiritual death of the human person in modernity. Like Dante's Inferno, that poem is set in hell, where Eliot quotes Dante directly at the beginning. A crowd flowed over London Bridge, so many, I had not thought death had undone so many. It's from the 3rd canto in the Inferno. Eliot speaks also of the fragmentation that is within us. Out of this stony rubbish, son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images, where the sun beats, and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water. Each of us knows directly in our own experience that we are not whole, not always integrated, and that we can be a heap of broken images, fragmented in so many aspects of our being, fragmented, as we Catholics say, in my thoughts and in my words, and what I've done and what I've failed to do. We say that at the beginning of every Mass. Hildebrand points that out, saying, our metaphysical situation of us is just put right out there on the table at the beginning. Let's be honest about who we are and then move forward. As Christians, we also know that the possibility of integration and of healing exists, and in fact, this has already begun through the life, death, and resurrection of Christ, and through a long and sometimes arduous journey in the light of grace to a loving union with God in this life and in the next one. Christian realism demands of us that we recognize the fragmentation of our metaphysical situation, but also the way that it has, at the deepest level, been healed. There's hope, then, and a path forward made possible by Christ and strengthened by grace toward a loving union with God that also promotes loving union with each other. They are always connected. So both Willard and Hildebrand understand our metaphysical situation. They understand the big picture. They offer diagnoses and solutions, and there's an explicit common denominator to their thought in this regard that's captured by a word both philosophers use frequently: transformation. Transformation. Hildebrand put that title in one of his books. We are, in the view of both of them, persons on the way in the journey of this life, broken, healed, and being transformed. Willard offers a diagnosis of our situation and renovation of the heart, beginning with the problem. He says, quote, "We must see the soul and the person in its ruined condition, with its malformed and dysfunctional mind, dysfunctional mind, feelings, body, social relations, before we can understand that it must be delivered and reformed, and how that can be done," end quote. There are examples of this fragmentation in Eliot's Wasteland. The breakdown of cultural institutions after the First World War captured there. It's evident in each of the characters that Eliot depicts. Fortune tellers, the young typist home at tea time for a disconnected sexual encounter, Mr. Eugenides, a Smyrna merchant looking for a lost weekend at the Metropole, the young woman in the poem who has just had an abortion. It's not sort of explicit in it, but It says, "I can't help it," she said, pulling a long face. "It's some pills I took to bring it off," she said. "She's had 5 already and nearly died of young George. The chemist said it would be all right, but I've never been the same." We also see the Fisher King and his woundedness in the poem as well. "A rat crept softly through the vegetation, dragging its slimy belly on the bank while I was fishing in the dull canal. On a winter evening, round behind the gas house, musing upon the king, my brother's wreck, and on the king, my father's death before him." Any of you seen the movie The Fisher King with Robin Williams and Jeff Bridges? It's a great movie. So we are in a moral wasteland, as T.S. Eliot saw it, and Willard, I think, would accept that the situation only expanded and deepened across the 20th century. He names several reasons for this: a general retreat from religion and theology, profound changes in higher education, where moral knowledge was once reliably passed from generation to generation, and the general zeitgeist of secular society, its failure to find a secular basis for moral knowledge, and the changing nature of our view of ourselves understood, quote, in terms of the soul and its nature and function, end quote. In this context, Willard gives substantial attention to the human body, and I'd like to follow his thinking for a bit here. He does not mince words. He writes, "We must see the soul and the person in its ruined condition," as I said. We need to see that it can be reformed, and we also need to think very practically about how this can be done. We have to begin from where we actually are, and this includes our redeemed state as well. After speaking of transformation of the mind and the will, Willard turns to the body, an object of spiritual transformation as well, in his view. The context of transformation of the body, he writes, "Spiritual transformation into Christ-likeness is the process of forming the inner world of the human self in such a way that it takes on the character of the inner being of Jesus himself. The result is that the outer life of the individual increasingly becomes a natural expression of the inner reality of Jesus and of his teachings." This transformation must include transforming the body, which is chapter 9 of his Renovation of the Heart. He begins realistically and then turns to practical matters. Willard recognizes in the fallen and redeemed human condition that the fact that our free will still has a tendency to pull us toward disintegration, toward evil. He writes of the body, "The inclinations to wrongdoing that literally inhabit its parts must be eliminated. The body must come to serve us primarily as an ally in Christ-likeness," different from what you often hear in contemporary visions of the body. I find, working in the sort of neuroscience world as I do, and thinking more recently about transgender issues, that the body has been split off and reduced to raw material for our use. If your gender doesn't fit, change your body, and it fits. Willard wants our bodies to be fully at God's disposal for a life of grace and sanctification. He gives 4 recommendations in Renovation of the Heart for how this process of bodily transformation can begin and continue. I'm not going to ask you to do them here, but think about doing them when you're home alone. It's a matter of not just seeing the body in an isolated way, but the whole person. There's 4 recommendations of these. You must actually release your body to God. You must actually release your body to God. Second, no longer idolize your body. Hildebrand wrote a book called Graven Images, about idols. Do not misuse your body. And fourth, the body is to be properly honored and cared for. This may sound theoretical initially, but he quickly moves to the practical. You must actually release your body to God. We need specific, concrete actions, Willard says, to open our bodies to transformation in Christ. Practically speaking, and you don't have to do it now, he encourages us to, quote, lie on the floor, face down or face up, and explicitly and formally surrender your body to God. Then take the time to go over the main parts of your body and do the same for each part. What you want to do is to ask God to take charge of your body and each part of it and to fill it with his life and use it for his purposes. So we don't just think of not sinning with the body. There's more to it than that. As he says, remember, a sacrifice is something to be taken up in God, something to be taken up and transformed. This is not meant to be a one-time event for him, but a periodic one, something we should do regularly. He also says, no longer idolize your body. The body cannot be, to use Hildebrand's phrase, a graven image, something we sculpt and fix and make perfect in sort of some image that we're thinking that we should look like, something we idolize and make an object of ultimate concern, as Willard says. We take care of our bodies, but not as an end in itself, but rather connected with the point just mentioned, to be taken up by God for God's purposes. Thirdly, he says, do not misuse your body. For Willard, this means first, to not use the body solely as a source of sensory gratification in a way that manipulates or dominates other persons, that instrumentalizes others. This, in his view, is the royal road to addiction. His counsel is to not use our bodies to intimidate others and not to abuse our bodies through overwork, and equally practically, to make sure we get enough sleep. I say that to my graduate students all the time, and I remind them that if you look at sleep neuroscience, one of the things they often say is that if you need to be woken up by an alarm clock in the morning, then you are by definition sleep deprived and you have a problem. 4, the body is to be properly honored and cared for. It's not just a matter of what we do and do not do with our bodies, but positive actions we take. And it's here that Willard speaks of the holiness of the body, of the need for refraining from engaging in wrong thought and action. Nourishment, exercise, and rest are essential for this aspect of transformation. We can't transform ourselves, we can't be transformed if we're just too tired. Here he makes a striking statement, one that in many ways has been forgotten in the moral vision of Christianity as well. He says the practical center for proper care of the body is the Sabbath. The center for care of our body is the Sabbath. I'll return to this after we've looked at Hildebrand. Lastly, for Willard, he speaks of the body's plasticity. This is a term one often hears in neuroscience about the way the brain can change its structure and connections by new learning and experience, but he speaks of the body as plastic in this way too. He says that with God's grace and our cooperation, the body God has given us is one that is plastic in the primary sense of being pliable and capable of being formed in various ways. This means, he says, that the very substance of our bodies is shaped by our actions as well as by grace into pathways of good or of evil. It's the spiritual disciplines that guide us on the way. He writes, what then is the specific role of the spiritual disciplines? Their role rests upon the nature of the embodied human self. They are to mold and to shape it, not just to shape ourselves or our inner life, but to shape our body as well. And our part in our redemption is through specific and appropriate activities to yield the plastic substance of which we are made to ways that a new life, which is imparted to us by the Spirit, can take root and grow. And then to Hildebrand. What's clear now from Dallas Hildebrand is also clear in the work of Dietrich von Hildebrand. They don't always say it the same way, but they're often talking about the same things. Think about the consonants of the two thinkers. The body is never separate from our relationship with God for Hildebrand, never separate from the spiritual life. It is integral to it at every stage of life, including the stage after we die, when our bodies will be rejoined with us. Hildebrand's vision of the person in regard to the spiritual life has an aspect that focuses on the body. He recognizes the body as an aspect of the person created by God and therefore good as well. He also recognizes the metaphysical situation of persons as created, fallen, and redeemed, and in need of assistance along the road to God. Both Hildebrand and Willard are concerned with human action through the body, and they approach it in different ways. It must be said that Willard exhibits the more practical and concrete concern with regard to the spiritual life, where Hildebrand kind of spreads himself everywhere. You have to go through all his works, like I said. Both philosophers have written explicitly about the heart. Hildebrand, if I may make a comparison, tends to turn his attention inward and to focus on our moral attitudes in the spiritual life, though without neglecting the reality of the body. His major work on the spiritual life, Transformation in Christ, which he wrote when he was fairly young and a fairly recent Catholic, is subtitled On the Christian Attitude. This tells us where his focus is going to be, on the attitudes of Christ as they impact our life and our transformation. The outlines of Hildebrand's moral vision, I think, are known to many, if not all of us here. His moral vision is a philosophy of value, and specifically of value response. To arrive at value, he names the 3 types or categories of importance, things that motivate us to thought and action. The first is the merely subjectively satisfying, and that which I find pleasing in some way, a good meal, a good glass of wine, good company. The second is the objective good for the person, that which is necessary for the person beyond any specific desire or satisfaction. So food, clothing, and shelter kind of come under that category. These two categories have a specific reference to kind of the individual person, the objective good for me, which might be different from the objective good for John Henry, or the objective good for Tim. It's still kind of grounded in us. But there is a third kind of importance, and this he calls the important in itself, something that is important apart from us, something that has an objective importance that we can come to recognize and respond to. This is his definition of value, that which is important in itself, not dependent on some aspect of me. And take a look, say, at the artworks around us in this room. They are, not me. I can look to them, and I can recognize beauty there. I can recognize aesthetic value and a variety of things. Those are not dependent on me. They call to me, and I can respond to them. An appropriate response to the aesthetic value of a beautiful painting or a beautiful scene in nature can include things like wonder, awe, delight. The appropriate response to the value that is a human person, Hildebrand says, includes reverence, respect, and love. Wojtyła's personalistic norm is the person is the kind of entity toward whom the only proper response is love. Now, this response to value is connected to Hildebrand's vision of the person. He describes what he calls the three spiritual centers of the person, the sources of our responding. There is a loving value responding center, the good stuff, and the two sources of trouble for us, which he kind of boils down to pride and concupiscence. Lust kind of written, but lust is easier to say than concupiscence. So I usually say that instead. And everybody knows what I mean when I say it. So Hildebrand names these three spiritual centers, and all three of them can bear fruit in human action, but the goal of the spiritual life is to transform into that loving value and responding center, so that is our fallback position in thought, in action, in feeling, in will. There's a Dantean aspect to Hildebrand's work as he describes the consequences of living out of those centers of pride and concupiscence. For Hildebrand, the goal of the spiritual life is to live out of that free, loving center. Willard mentioned the Sabbath in his work. As we knew from our reading group and subsequent contacts with each other, it's not enough to simply lament the disappearance of moral knowledge. That's an important first step. Then you got to do something about it. And a lot of the conversation in the group is, okay, what do we do about it? Those who are aware of the loss, who have striven to keep moral knowledge alive in their work, have a responsibility to do what they can in a given zeitgeist, which will not always be receptive to the work for the restoration of moral knowledge. We can certainly do this in our own lives and in the lives we touch. And while that's necessary, we need to have it to give it to others. We can't give what we don't have. And so our own transformation is integral to the transformation of the world. Now, the Willard of von Hildebrand would be satisfied if we simply stop with a lamentation. They would both say yes, and then what? I thought about this question in light of Willard's twofold insight that the route back to public moral knowledge in our culture first must be to avoid the pitfall of introducing moral knowledge in inappropriate ways that will repel rather than attract. How you say it matters. How you present it matters. Second, we need a constant primary subject to be the focus of that process, and for Willard, that is the good person. He speaks at length in the disappearance of moral knowledge about the notion of the good person as a central subject of moral theory at the conclusion of the disappearance of moral knowledge. This is very much in keeping with the gospel message as well. Jesus talked relatively sparingly about rules and regulations, but he talked a great deal about the type of person he wanted us to be. It's a very practical project. Willard notes that it's essential in our current circumstances to identify a good person as the central subject of moral theory. So what does that mean? What does it mean to be a good person? In real life, the good person stands out as one who characteristically evokes trust, admiration, support, and a desire to be associated with and to imitate. It provokes a value response, I think, is the way that Hildebrand would put that. We are confronted with a good person, someone who radiates goodness, and we respond to that in these ways. Many of the key moments in John's gospel often occur in direct face-to-face conversations with individuals. The Sermon on the Mount is not in John's gospel, it's in Matthew. In John, Jesus has direct conversations with single individual people, and amazing things happen there. They all come to him thinking they know everything. They're asking the questions. Jesus takes their questions, transforms them, and then gives them back to them. And all of a sudden, they become a different kind of questioner. Nicodemus, the Samaritan woman at the well, the woman caught in adultery. In intimacy, face to face, transformation happens. I know there are some of you here in the group who have become Catholic over the years, and I'd be willing to bet that it was not because you read a good book in moral theology. As I read, I came upon something in Willard's Renovation of the Heart that caught me by surprise. In his chapter, Transforming the Body, right after speaking about those 4 points for spiritual formation that I mentioned earlier, we find this statement: the practical center of proper care for the body is the Sabbath. And that got me thinking. Willard calls the Sabbath a celebration of God and says that Sabbath is inseparable from worship, and indeed, genuine worship is Sabbath. I suspect for most of us, 2 things come to mind when we hear the word Sabbath. We don't work that day, and we go to church. And that's true, but it is a beginning. It's indeed about rest, and the rest that Willard writes of is, he says that rest is one primary mark of the condition of Sabbath in the body. It requires a sufficient amount of rest to be able to let God transform us. Unrest is a mark of its absence, and transformation does not happen then. The absence of rest has an immediate effect on the body's transformation. In this case, as Willard says, it's regression, and our regression along with it. If we are not rested, on the other hand, the body moves to the center of our focus and makes its presence more strongly felt, and the tendencies of its parts call out more strongly for gratification. The sensual desires and ego demands will have greater power over us through our desperate bodies. In addition, our awareness of what they are doing, and it's very subtle, what's happening around us, will be less sharp and decisive. For the journey of transformation in Christ, this is the way backwards. When we don't give the body sufficient attention, we don't give our corporeality in an integrated way the chance to rest and the chance to worship, we move backward instead of forward. Willard further comments, the body must be weaned away from its tendencies to always take control, to run the world, to achieve and produce, to attain gratification. Hildebrand approaches the question of the Sabbath from a liturgical perspective, centering his attention on the transformative aspects of the liturgy in a more objective way. Sunday Mass is what it is. It doesn't change kind of from week to week for us Catholics. There's probably about 10 years ago, they changed like one phrase in the Mass. And so instead of at the end of the readings, they used to say, "This is the word of the Lord." And we'd all say, "Thanks be to God." They changed that to "the word of the Lord," because that's what's in the Latin text. Like, oh my God, something changed. It stays the same. We come to it and let ourselves be transformed by it. There's some unpublished work of Hildebrand's that I think John Henry will talk about these a little bit later. He used to have people come to his home and would comment on some aspects of the liturgical year, the readings for the day, the liturgical season, and he would talk about the Mass. And with regard to the Sabbath, he said that the actions and words of the liturgy are instrumental in creating habits of mind that direct both mind and body toward God along the spiritual journey. If, as Willard says, the way back to moral knowledge is to focus on the good person, that also means focusing on what the good person does, the type of person that he is and lives, and the type of life that he or she leads, and with Hildebrand, the fundamental moral attitudes that underlie and give impetus to that life. I often find it curious in modern life that some of the 10 Commandments we follow to the letter. I think probably no one in this room is habitually stealing, committing adultery, things like that, but many of us take this, honor the Sabbath as kind of an optional commandment. I've been to lots of Sunday morning soccer games because that's when they schedule them. My daughter's soccer, and so there are a lot of things that impinge on the weekends that we have to make choices about whether or not we're going to do them. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. We need to give some thought to what that means to us as Christians because, as Abraham Heschel says, who we are depends on what the Sabbath is to us. It's a matter of identity. Who we are depends on what it is, depends on how we live it. He describes the Sabbath not as an interlude, but as the climax of living. The other days of the week exist for the Sabbath, not the other way around. They're the build-up to it, and it's the climax of the week. We live, however, in a contemporary zeitgeist of materialism, accumulation, utilitarian attitudes. I think both Willard and Hildebrand would agree in the end with Heschel's words, the Sabbath teaches all beings whom to praise. It teaches all beings whom to praise, not a graven image, but God. Dallas Willard and Dietrich von Hildebrand both recognize the roots of the loss of moral knowledge, and both of them meet Willard's criteria of the good person. There's very much agreement there. There are models of good persons we can look to, learn from, and seek to emulate along a road that they themselves have already traveled, leaving us signposts in their writing and their example of where the road is and how the journey is to be made. I never got to meet either one of them, and I wish I could have. It would have been amazing. At least that's what I hear from folks who knew them. In terms of the models of person we've considered today, we know that persons are an integral reality, and that what happens in one aspect of us resonates throughout, impacting everything in ways both conscious and unconscious. To be a person is to be whole, and it's the ultimate end of the journey of integration. Willard and Hildebrand both understood that this journey was, from its inception to its end, a journey of love that leads to the integration of ourselves and a journey toward a loving union with God that, yes, will be consummated in heaven, but already exists here. They both arrived at the end of life's journey, and they can say, with T.S. Eliot at the end of 4 quartets, "And all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, when the tongues of flames are enfolded into the crowned knot of fire, and the fire and the rose are one." Thank you. Tim, it's your turn.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you to the organizers of this event. It's just a real joy to be together this week. Professor Beauregard's paper focuses on the importance of understanding the way in which the embodied nature of the human self is connected to being a good person, with practical application to the use of spiritual disciplines, especially the discipline of Sabbath rest. He calls us to pay careful attention to the centrality of the human person's bodily, affective nature, as it ought to be directed toward what Hildebrand calls the important in itself. This is done in order to provide a path toward the reappearance of moral knowledge, beginning with the individual practice and moving toward institutional change. Beauregard's emphasis on the need for the relationship of the psychological and spiritual and bodily elements of the human self are especially salient in this project. In fact, Willard begins similarly in his work on the disappearance of moral knowledge by listing 6 or 7 major causes or reasons for the disappearance of moral knowledge, the second of which is directly related to Beauregard's paper. Here are Willard's lists of causes of the disappearance of moral knowledge. 1, the discrediting of religion as a source of knowledge of reality, and specifically moral reality. And number 2 is the disappearance of the human self from acceptable domains of knowledge. 3, variations from morality from culture to culture. 4, moral standards seen as power plays. 5, morality is harmful. 6, the fear or resentment of knowledge itself. And maybe a 7th, morally wrong to make moral judgments. It's from the disappearance of moral knowledge in the first few pages. I think that was part of our reading as well for this week. Beauregard's paper really does an excellent job of prodding us to consider how the human self might need to make a reappearance as an acceptable domain of knowledge, as parallel, or maybe even a prior task in the project of the restoration of moral knowledge. There's a great deal of work to be done here, especially for psychologists and philosophers focusing on theoretical foundations in the discipline of psychology. There's a real need for a clear defense of the human person understood as a body-soul composite. The resources of an Aristotelian, maybe a Thomistic substance dualism, coupled with a robust realist personalist philosophy, might be the right step as a major alternative to what Willard calls the dominance of empiricism. Beauregard's paper deals quite a bit with the body and disciplines that moderate it. In a sensate culture like ours, it is not so much the existence of the body and that we in our current institutions struggle with. Rather, it's what counts as good when it comes to the use of our bodies. Just as a side note, Carl Trueman's recent book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, I think is a very important recent work on the intellectual and practical history of the loss of the self in our current condition, which explains, I think in part, he's a historian, so this is more, I think, situated for a historical understanding, but there's a rich philosophy in it as well. That explains in part the impossibility of moral judgment in many areas of how we act with our bodies in relation to others. The older view of a substantial self, understood as a body-soul composite, is now lost. Willard writes, "The inner dynamic of a non-physical soul or person weaving its own life together by choosing to follow rationally grounded moral insights disappeared from possible cognitive view. It wasn't scientific. And with it, moral knowledge that had such a person as its subject matter. Moral knowledge naturally disappears when its subject matter disappears." Willard also adds that since moral knowledge is, if the great tradition, I would add Aquinas and Aristotle are especially important here, was correct, knowledge of the human soul or self, it is only to be expected that, with the loss of knowledge of the self, moral knowledge would lose its subject matter and disappear along with the self. The return of the soul and spirit of persons in an embodied self is a necessary precondition to the restoration of moral knowledge. This involves the defense of the immaterial nature of the soul and mind, and an account of the relation between the soul and the body, no small task. But the task itself shows the way in which moral knowledge is connected to knowledge of the self. I think that this is especially relevant to the types of models of the self that Beauregard offers at the beginning of the paper, as part in that diagram that was passed around. Exploring the ways that Burgos's diagrams are connected to Willard's view of the self might be especially helpful in moving forward with the relation between models of the self and moral knowledge. Willard describes the self as a tightly unified and substantial field of conscious intentionalities and intentions of thoughts, feelings, and dispositions, which had always been primary to ethical judgment, sentiment, and understanding. It's from The Disappearance, page 10. Defending this view coupled with Burgos's model might offer better and clearer descriptions of the self, which have greater explanatory power, scope, and fecundity to the various contemporary naturalist materialist options at hand. These naturalist and empiricist options that Willard describes as ones in which, quote, the treatment of the self is governed by unconscious and irrational forces of various kinds, or possibly something just non-existent. The significant names here are Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, Marx, Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, Freud, along with Mill, Ernst Mach, and William James, later running aside in a more empiricist vein, along with behaviorism, positivism, logical behaviorism, and then DNA and brain chemistry, which currently is perhaps most favored as the avenue for understanding human beings. Following Willard's point here, I believe that the application of Beauregard's work in this paper to a reductionist, quote-unquote, neuroethics, everything's neuro now, maybe it'll be AI eventually, it's all AI ethics, neuro-AI.
That's already here.
That's right, yeah. I think that's very important in this respect to this idea of reductionist neuroethics. One way to see this is to think about how Beauregard's use of Burgos's model of the self relates to the very notion of psychopathology. Without a defense of this model beginning with and including a robust realist metaphysics of the soul and body and the proper relation between the two, the very notion of psychopathology is impossible to defend, and any moral judgments that may go with it. How can there be a pathology of the soul and body composite unity if there's no knowledge of the real self upon which both psychological and moral knowledge rests? Knowledge of the nature of the self and moral knowledge are inseparable. If there is a knowable essential nature to being human, then we can know how it ought to be. Let me turn to a few ways that I believe Beauregard's paper can be strengthened. First, I think that the paper can be strengthened by connecting the sabbatical practice back to the bodily, and both of those back to the models of the self presented at the beginning of the paper. Perhaps following Willard and Hildebrand, one might start with an actual negative case of a psychopathological condition, stemming from a lack of sabbatical rest, and tracing it to a disorder in the self as understood in Burgos's model. Perhaps pointing directly to a disruption or disorder in Burgos's diagram caused by a lack of rest, and then showing how the discipline of rest ameliorates that disorder would strengthen the paper by making the problems and the solution more explicit. Second, it might be interesting to show how Sabbath rest fits into Hildebrand's view of importance. So here are a few questions. I think these were kind of addressed in the paper. I think maybe addressing them again in our conversations might be fruitful. Number one, does resting on the Sabbath fall into the merely subjectively satisfying? I personally don't have to imagine that I find naps on a Sunday incredibly subjectively satisfying. Something I don't have to imagine. But can I Sabbath in the wrong way and for the wrong reasons? Number 2, is keeping a Sabbath just an objective good for the person, to use Hildebrand's notion, just like eating my veggies? It seems like Jesus had a few things to say about this to the Pharisees who maintained that the Sabbath rest was an important objective good. 3, is resting on the Sabbath important in itself? Is a Sabbath rest a real value? Does a Sabbath rest call us to, quote, call to us and demand from us demand an appropriate response from us, as Hildebrand writes? On the third question, it's fascinating to see the parallels between Hildebrand's ethics and Lewis's abolition of man. What Hildebrand calls real value, the important in itself, Lewis calls the doctrine of objective value, or for brevity and inclusion, the Tao. This is the idea that certain beliefs and attitudes are really true and others really false to the kind of thing the universe is and the kinds of things that we are. And Lewis writes that to recognize the Tao, objective value, is to recognize a quality which demands a certain response from us, whether we make it or not. At a conference like this, getting Hildebrand and Willard together, is it reasonable to introduce Lewis as a third wheel? I mean, it's like, okay, we just one too many philosophers in the canoe today. Yeah. Hildebrand quotes from Lewis's Abolition of Man in his discussion of relativism, and Willard refers to Lewis throughout his writings. But according to John Crosby in his introduction to Hildebrand's Ethics, there are astonishing convergences between the value theory that Lewis sketches out in this work and the developed value theory of Hildebrand, but neither of these authors influenced the other. So, does Sabbath rest demand an appropriate response from us, as Lewis and Hildebrand describe, of objective value? Beauregard states that we can, quote, think about Sabbath as an essential quality of the good person. This is a strong claim. This seems to imply that if I don't have an appropriate response regarding the Sabbath, which is demanded of me, if I don't appropriately rest on the Sabbath, I guess we could quibble about which day of the week it is. Do we have any Seventh-day Adventist philosophers? Okay, we quibble about that over dinner, I guess. It seems like if I don't rest on the Sabbath, I will fail to be a good person. Does not resting on the Sabbath keep me from being a good person in Willard's sense? A person intent upon advancing the various goods of human life with which they are effectively in contact in a manner that respects the relative degrees of importance of those goods and the extent to which their actions can actually promote the existence and maintenance of those goods. It's from The Disappearance, page 359. I think it's possible to defend the idea that a Sabbath rest is a real value and important in itself and contributes to being a good person in Willard's sense. One way to make this defense would be to explore with Hildebrand and Aquinas on how rest on the Sabbath contributes to our relationship with God and an ongoing conversion to Christ. I think that's probably easier to do as Christians than it might be to think about Sabbath as something attractive for people who don't know God or have a relationship with Him through Christ. In a natural moral law sense. Like you might have to do this slightly differently. But I think as Christians, we can think about how a Sabbath contributes to our relationship with God and our sanctification. Perhaps a Sabbath rest coupled with other disciplines can, as Hildebrand writes, give a man the experience that Christ is the fulfillment of his innermost desires. In this sense, St. Augustine says, our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. From the Ethics, page 233, and from the Confessions. Thank you very much.